Good evening and welcome to ABN's Jihad Watch program. I'm Robert Spencer, and we are continuing this week with our series of interviews with people who are on the front lines defending freedom around the world today. And I'm very privileged to have with me this evening Charles Jacobs, who is the founder of Americans for Peace and Tolerance, which is a group in the New England area fighting against Islamic supremacism and the furthering of Sharia objectives there. And also, Charles Jacobs is a hero in his work as a founder of the American Anti-Slavery Group, which went into Sudan under very dangerous conditions and freed slaves there, leading to ultimately the founding of the new Christian state of South Sudan. And so welcome, Charles Jacobs.
Thank you for having me, Robert. It's an honor to be with you anywhere.
Thank you very much. Charles, the topic tonight is the silent persecution. And I know that you are very familiar, as one of the people on the front lines in the Sudan, with the persecution of Christians around the world. Can you sketch out for us, just to begin with, a little bit of what exactly Christians are up against in Muslim countries today?
Sure. I'm not the expert in this, you are, but I do read. And I read your website and I read other websites, and it's clear to me that while the Christians have just celebrated Easter, this may be a time extraordinarily daunting time. I think one of the biggest challenges that Christianity has ever faced. All around the Middle East, you see that Christians are besieged by the winners of the Arab Spring, that is the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamic radicals. In Egypt, they're terrified. The Copts in Egypt, who Christianity preceded Islam in Egypt by many centuries, are besieged. Their churches are burned. Their daughters are raped. They're being forced to convert to Islam. They're terrified of what's going to happen. They're the largest remaining segment of Christianity in the Middle East. I think the figures are, after World War I, Christians made up about 20% of the people in the Middle East, and now they're down to, I think it's less than 1%. So
about 3% and going down.
The rise of Islamic radicalism has, I'm Jewish, and I have to tell you that I fear for my people very, very much in the Middle East. We have Iran threatening to make another Holocaust. We have on all sides, the same people in the Arab Spring are mounting efforts on the right-hand side. You've got Syria on the left and Jordan. On the left-hand side, you've got Egypt. So I'm very, very worried about the Jewish people. But I have to say that the people in most danger in the world today are the Christians in the Middle East. I worked in Sudan with a group called Christian Solidarity International out of Zurich and now out of America as well. And John Eibner, who was the hero, the Christian hero, who led the slave redemptions of Christians in Sudan, when he goes to Iraq, he is tearful about when he meets the Christians in Iraq. So all over, and I think, Robert, you can describe this with better data than I have. It's clear that the Christians, given the rise of Islamic fundamentalism and the Arab Spring, are in immediate, clear and present danger. And it strikes me that the West is shamefully silent. And there are two pieces of that we can talk about. Where the heck is the human rights community, which bemoans seemingly so many things in the world, but is silent on this? And I have something special to say about that because I saw it in Sudan. And then I think we need to talk about the Christians in this country, and in the West, but particularly in America, where is the Christian voice for their brethren? So I think without that voice, the Christians in the Middle East will be lost. I mean, where is the Christian voice in America? And how to explain that even though it's true, the media doesn't report this and marginalizes this and distorts this, and every time they, report about some terrible thing that's happened, it's kind of morally equivalent. Well, there's inter-ethnic strife, and it's ethnic strife, it's one group against another, when in fact, it's not that at all. It's that they're fearful of connecting the dots, but the dots do point to a pattern, which is that Islamism or Islam, or however you want to describe it, has targeted the Christians. And they mean them harm, and they mean them very bad harm. So where is the voice of Christianity in the West?
Well, this is a very important question, Charles, and this is, of course, our topic for discussion for tonight, and so there are many aspects of it. Just to give a little background first, as you noted, Christians are facing escalating persecution because of the Arab Spring, because of the ascendancy of Islamic supremacist pro-Sharia groups, the Salafis, the Muslim Brotherhood, and so on, all across North Africa and the Middle East. But Christians are facing escalating persecution elsewhere as well. In Nigeria, in Iraq, in Syria, of course, that's part of the uprising against Assad. The so-called rebels are fiercely persecuting the Christians there. In Indonesia, just today, as a matter of fact, at Jihad Watch this morning, I put up a post about the Indonesian religious affairs minister who said that the Christians have brought their troubles upon themselves, that they are asking for churches to be built when it's not permitted. And of course, Islamic law forbids Christians to build new churches. And so he's saying this is just an administrative difficulty, but the Christians deserve what they get. And they're getting more and more violence and houses of worship being burnt down and so on, not only in Indonesia, but elsewhere in the Islamic world. And so your question then becomes all the more pointed. Why is it exactly that the Christians in the West are silent? Why is the church in the United States so indifferent to the plight of the persecuted Christians? And I can give you a personal example that, of course, you're familiar with, Charles, that I was invited to speak at a Catholic men's conference in the Diocese of Worcester, Massachusetts, and was canceled after Muslims protested by the bishop. And the bishop gave the reason that I was not to speak because I would damage the wonderful dialogue that he was having with the Muslims in Worcester. And he said that discussion of the Muslim persecution of Christians and the root causes of it in the texts and teachings of Islam that the Islamic supremacists point to justify that persecution would damage the dialogue. And so then the question becomes, well, what on earth is the dialogue for then? If it's not to try to work for the protection of victimized people, then what's the point of it? And so,
well, you know the answer. You know the real answer, Robert. The dialogue is to make them feel good about themselves. The dialogue
right.
is so that they can say, we're not Islamophobic, we're not racist, we're not bigots. I had the same situation not too far from Worcester in the Boston Jewish community when it was discovered that the Saudis funded the largest mosque in the Cradle of Liberty in Boston, Massachusetts, the largest mosque. And that mosque had on its board of trustees none other than Yusuf Qaradawi, the head of the Muslim Brotherhood. I had all of these dhimmi Jews running around, bowing to them and dialoguing with them and being fooled by them, until the point came when somebody found out that one of these outreach people who was who was in charge of the dialogue had, from the Arab side, had written in the Arab papers that Jews are the sons of monkeys and pigs and the rapists of Allah and all of these horrible things. And even then, the Jews didn't want to pull back from the dialogue, because what would that mean about them? That would mean about them, you see, they've internalized this poison, that they were in fact bigots. So I understand completely what happened to you in Worcester, and it's and those people who do this, that is on our side, the Jewish and Christian clergy who are fools and just absolute useful idiots. They have to be challenged and embarrassed and shamed, because after all, this man who decided not to have you come and inform the Christians of Worcester what's happening to their brothers and sisters, he is putting their lives in danger, and over over his own feelings about himself, that he's a good person and is open and open and open to all kinds of discussions with people who say to his face that they just want peace. This is sinful. This is a shame. He should be attacked.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Charles. At least attacked rhetorically, not
Yeah.
physically, just in case
No,
the
no, no,
predators
no,
are listening. But
no.
in any case, it's noteworthy what you say about the Boston Jewish community, because I want to remind people that Sheikh Qaradawi, who was on this board of the mosque in Boston, has actually praised Hitler and called for Muslims to finish the job that Hitler started, that is, the genocide of the Jews. And for Jews themselves to not want to protest against this is suicidally short-sighted. And it's astonishing, the grip of political correctness in the Jewish and Christian communities in the United States, that they don't even realize that what is in play is exactly their survival, and that this is not just some sort of academic question. And to choose to align with one's persecutors and those who are out to destroy you at the risk of being branded a bigot, it's astonishing that, well, you can slit my throat, but as long as you don't call me a racist, it's okay. That's really what amounts to what's going on here.
And it even went beyond that. We found that on the website of the Islamic Society of Boston, which constructed the mosque, which, by the way, the land was given to them practically for nothing by the mayor of Boston, who is like any other mayor in any other American city, doesn't know what to make of this, can only treat the Muslim population as just one more set of immigrant peoples. And so if you don't like them, you probably don't like black people. I mean, that's the mindset. And so the Islamic Society of Boston had on its website instructions on how to beat your wife. So, I mean, and by the way, maybe you know this and your audience doesn't, but there are ways to beat your wife that are kosher, in so to speak.
Well, let's say halal. There are ways to
Halal.
beat your wife that are halal, that are acceptable in Islam, because the Quran says in chapter 4, verse 34, that good women are obedient, and as for those that are not, you give them a warning, send them to separate beds, and beat them. The three-stage
Right. And in this one actually was pretty colorful, because the description said, well, you have to keep the whip up somewhere in a public space in your apartment, maybe above the mantle. And so every time she would walk by there, maybe she would know who's the boss.
Oh, yeah.
So it's not just that the Jews are committing cultural suicide by fooling themselves on purpose about
As if
this.
that weren't enough.
As if that weren't enough, even the people who most defend women's rights, and that's, practically everybody in Boston, but certainly the elites, and certainly the Boston Globe, and certainly the Jews, and certainly the progressives, even they wouldn't say a word about beating your wife on the website of the Islamic Society of Boston. And of course they took that down, but we have it easily available to access again. But they took it down after we embarrassed them.
Huh.
The thing about the Christians, and this is what I understand, why the left, the so-called progressives, won't do a thing to help the Christians. I understand that very well, because I ran into that when I was trying to help the black Christian slaves. And I thought to myself at the beginning, very naively, well, all I've got to do is to write about the fact that black people are enslaved. And, Amnesty International will come out into the streets of Manhattan and close up Wall Street until they're freed. Isn't that what was the logical thought? Well, guess what? They didn't, and they didn't want to, and they didn't want to hear about it. And they did have some reports about it, but they were in the back of the file cabinet. And I thought about it for a long, long time. How was it that the progressives didn't want to touch black slavery? I mean, after all, was it because did America not care about black suffering? No, America did a lot when it came to apartheid in South Africa, and Amnesty International among them. But it turns out that the human rights community has got a flaw, and I call it the human rights complex. And it's that these people are not driven by justice or injustice. They're driven by their own guilt that they have internalized about Western past sins or current sins. And they march under the banner of "not in my name." And they're doing things to get expiation and exoneration for all the bad the white people have done in the world. And so, yes, they're going to go out and protest apartheid if it's done by people like themselves, by whites, right? But when things are done by people who are not like, by non-Westerners, they cringe. It doesn't fit they don't get any expiation points whatsoever if they free a black slave from an Arab. God forbid, and they'll be in the way of Middle East peace, because then people might start to think about who really is on the other side of these conflicts. So we couldn't get anyone. I shouldn't say anyone, because there were some decent, honest liberals. I mean, there was Nat Hantoff, and there were, we got the Black Caucus because it was blacks. But the major force behind the freeing of black slaves in Sudan were the Christians, and Pat Robertson, and and just decent people who cared and didn't politicize this. So I understand why the progressive side of the house, which falsely claims to be all about justice, but which is not at all about justice. It's about themselves and their belly buttons and their moral purity. I understand why they're silent about the Christians, because they don't want to say anything bad about the Muslims. They don't want to say anything bad about Islamic leadership. They don't want to see any patterns here. And in addition to that, they have adversaries at home who are Christian, because of the other issues that divide them, like abortion and gay marriage.
So Charles, they do have adversaries. It's not as if they don't want to say anything bad about anyone. They don't have any problem criticizing their political opponents on other issues. So when you say they don't want to say anything bad about the Muslims, why is that? What is it that makes Islam sort of a protected, off-limits thing that nobody can speak ill about, even when it's amply justified?
Well, I would say that Islam fits into a broader category called the other. And the moral teaching of the day for the secularists is that the other is better than you. And the other could be communists. The other could be, black people. The other could be anybody. But the big other is the Muslims, because they're the other that is on your side when you are criticizing the West. So the Left Muslim Alliance didn't just pop out of thin air. It's that the left shares with the Muslim anti-Western push, in that they're both against capitalism, they're both against Western power, they're both seemingly against white guys with guns, they're both against, and so the left thinks that the hard left, the Marxist left, thinks that religion is the opiate of the people, and that all these Muslim people yelling about Allah, they're just that's not real. That's an epiphenomenon.
So what is real? What do they think is going on there?
What they think is real is that there's poor people just rising up for justice, and so they just happen to clothe it in Islamic language.
So if they get socialism, then everything will be okay.
They get socialism, and everything will be okay. They'll drop all of this religion stuff, and then we'll all live one big happy family of man.
Okay.
Now, of course, we know what will happen if, God forbid, the Muslims win. They will be the first ones in the fire, the useful idiots on the left.
Yeah.
So I understand why the people who falsely claim to be for human rights, that is Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the UN, my goodness, or the progressive, all those people who falsely claim that they're doing this for justice. I understand why they haven't lifted a finger and even actually done harm to block the news about what's happening to the Christians in the Middle East and elsewhere. I understand that. It's harder for me as a Jewish person to understand the silence of the Christians. And then I have to tell you one story that made me understand this. Um, I was a guest speaker at Gordon College, Christian college, not too far from here. Wonderful place. And the event was a commemoration of Kristallnacht, the first assault on Jews in the Holocaust, where Kristallnacht, where all the Jewish stores and the glass of the stores were broken, and the Jews were dragged out into the streets and forced to, with toothbrushes scrub the streets, and were tortured and murdered and dragged off. So that Kristallnacht was the bell that rang, and if you didn't know before this, you certainly had no right to not to know anymore that the Jews were going to be done away with. Okay, so this was a commemoration of Kristallnacht at a Christian college, and I was the Jewish speaker, and I said to them, look, I understand and appreciate Christian Zionism and the Christian love of the Jews. I understand it and appreciate it more than a lot of other people. And I've been saying in my community that the Christians are the most important allies the Jews have. Not an easy sell, right? Because we don't have a great past. Not an easy sell. But I've been doing that for 20 years. And the Jews are turning. The Jews are learning that this is true. I said, but here you are condemning the silence that happened about what happened to my people. How many of you know the name Anne Frank? And of the 400 people, there wasn't a hand that didn't go up. Everybody knew Anne Frank. And then I said, how many of you know the name, and I'm sorry, I forgot it right now. There was a name of, and you may know it, Robert. There was a Coptic Christian boy who was killed in his own classroom in Cairo because he had the sign of the cross on his hand, like Christian.
I know the incident, but I don't think I ever knew his name, actually.
Yeah,
and that in itself is an indication.
I said, how many of you know about that case? 3 people raised their hand. I said, so how, you explain to me, how can you be good enough, and you are, to demand that we apologize, that you apologize, and the world apologize, and say never again will there be silence in the face of genocide, and there you are, your people, your brothers and your sisters are about to be slaughtered in Egypt, and Syria, oh my God, when Assad falls, wow, what's going to happen? It's terrible to even to contemplate. So how can you be silent? And I let them have it, and I have this arrangement with my Christian partners. They come to synagogues and slap the faces of all the Jews in the audience about Jewish silence about what's going on with Islamic Jew hatred. And I'm allowed to go in front of churches and Christian groups and slap them for their own silence. It works out pretty good. It's a good deal. You and I should do some of this.
Absolutely. It's very important, I think. What I first read, actually, when I was reading in the 90s, the works of Bat Yaor, the great historian, who is the pioneering scholar of dhimmitud, the institutionalized mistreatment of non-Muslims under Islamic law. And she argues very forcefully that Jews and Christians need to unite and understand that we face the same fate together, that Islamic law envisions a subjugated status, denied basic rights for both of us, and lives of institutionalized discrimination and harassment. And it's a shame, it makes me ashamed as a Christian to know about the history of Christian anti-Semitism, and I understand well why Jews would be suspicious of Christian groups today. But it's very important to realize that the world keeps moving, and every day brings a new situation. And we can't be fighting the last war when a new war has broken out. And it is not the situation in the world today, after the Catholic Church has publicly renounced and apologized for anti-Semitism and rejected anti-Semitic readings of the New Testament, and when so many other Christian groups have done the same thing. It's imperative that we stand together, and anti-Semitism is intrinsic within Islam, but it is not intrinsic within Christianity. And we do face the same foe who would conquer and subjugate both of us. And so I applaud what you're doing with the Christian groups, and I'd be very happy to help out in any way that I could.
So let me tell you, so there I was in the podium, and I was practically charging these people with the crime of silence, and I was supposed to be, not doing, I wasn't invited because they thought I would do that. Afterwards, many people came up to me and they said, you don't understand. You don't understand, Charles. We Christians are not like you Jews. I said, what do you mean? You're a family. Abraham is your blood. One Jewish guy gets kidnapped, Gilad Shalit, in Israel, and the entire Jewish world goes nuts. We're not like that. We see the other Christians as, well, they're kind of like us, but we're not a family. And I said to them, the jihad's going to cure you of this problem.
That's right.
Because to the people who want to kill Christians over there, you are their brothers.
Oh, yeah.
And so you better be their brothers.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Charles, we're coming up to the midway point, and so it's time for a break. We will be right back after these important messages with more with Charles Jacobs of the American Anti-Slavery Group and Americans for Peace and Tolerance, the great anti-slavery crusader from Sudan. And this is the ABN's Jihad Watch program, and I'm Robert Spencer. We'll be right back after this. Good evening and welcome back to ABN's Jihad Watch program. I'm Robert Spencer, and we're here tonight with the freedom fighter Charles Jacobs, who has gone to Sudan to free Christian slaves from Muslim persecutors and has fought against Islamic supremacism in the New England area. Charles, welcome back. We're discussing the silent persecution of Christians and why Christians in the West are silent about the rampant persecution and escalating persecution of Christians in the Muslim world. And we were talking before the break about how you've touched on actually several times how these Christian groups are above all afraid of being portrayed as racists, as bigoted, and as falling out with politically correct pieties. Now, isn't that something that Islamic supremacist groups, Muslim Brotherhood groups in the U.S., like the Council on American Islamic Relations and others, exploit in order to maintain this silence about the persecution of Christians and other non-Muslims in the Islamic world?
Yes, they've got America pretty flummoxed because what they do is they invented this term Islamophobia. Phobia is really an irrational fear of something. Why in the world should you be afraid of Islam? You must be a hateful person. This is foolishness. There's lots of reasons to be afraid of what many Islamists have done. So you're not irrational when you're fearful. And it's a way, it's just flipped reality on its head. And so, the politically correct, mostly secular mindset is I want to be a good person. And I don't want to be charged with harboring any bad feelings, especially when this is tied to racism, which of course is foolish because it's about a doctrine, it's not about a race. So people are fooled by this, and the leftist professors, the radical professors, and the elite media have all jumped on board this bandwagon and have practically made it dangerous or difficult for anyone to speak the truth. And any of us who do speak the truth, we take a risk. You take the biggest risk, Robert, but all people who want to just say the obvious truth, even an innocent college freshman who might want to express something that's absolutely obvious, would soon learn that all hellfire would come upon his or her head by simply saying the absolute innocent truth about what's to be worried about in this world.
Yeah,
So,
you're absolutely right. Just recently I read a very revealing email exchange that was published online by Sam Harris. And of course, Sam Harris, you may know, is a writer of books about atheism. He's an atheist advocate of sorts. He's written a book called The End of Faith. He's written a book criticizing Christianity. And he has written some things that are critical of Islam. And suddenly, all his friends on the left in America, they branded him Islamophobic. And Glenn Greenwald, who is, of course, a very far-left political writer in the U.S., wrote a tweet repeating the link to an Al Jazeera story criticizing Harris and other atheists for criticizing Islam. And Harris was taken aback because he had thought that Greenwald was a friend. And he asked him, why did you send around this empty, irrational, defamatory piece that just calls me names and doesn't deal with any of the points that I've raised? And Greenwald said, well, it does look like you're trafficking in racism and Islamophobia. And I thought, well, there's, I could say to Sam Harris, welcome to my world. And you know that anyone, no matter what their political persuasion is, no matter what they think about other things, no matter how much they may have been a darling of the left beforehand, if they dare to speak out about the oppression of Christians by Muslims or about the oppression that is institutionalized in Islamic law, then they get tarred as racists, bigots, Islamophobes, and so on. But this is a tactic. This is a tactic precisely designed by Islamic supremacists in order to stigmatize and marginalize and demonize and rule out of acceptable discourse anyone and everyone who dares to tell the truth about this oppression that is institutionalized in Sharia, in Islamic law. And so the ultimate goal, it seems to me, is to remove all obstacles to the spread of Islamic supremacism in the United States and elsewhere. What would you think about that?
I think that's exactly right. And the question for us intellectuals in the West, and I think we failed in this, is to understand precisely what it is about leftist thinking that makes them so vulnerable about this. And I've seen this. I come at this from the left-wing Jews who don't like Israel perspective, and I think it goes something like this. If it's Islam, that's the problem. If it's Islamic radicalism, that's the problem. Then it's not America that's the problem. And that's what the left wants to make it seem. If it's us that's the problem in the world, then we can do something about it. We can make more concessions. We can be nicer. We can give them some of what they want. But we won't have to fight. If it's not them, but it's us that's the problem, then I don't have to worry about this long-range combat that we have ahead of us. I don't have to be like Robert Spencer and Charles Jacobs and have sleepless nights about this irrational seeming hatred of us that only has to do with who we are and not what we do. But if I can turn it around, and if I can make it that it's us that is causing the hatred of the Muslim world against the West, then I can do something about it. And I've seen this with the Jews who want Israel to lay down their arms and give away the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. I can explain this from the point of the Jews, because we are like an abused people. This analysis comes from the abused wife whose husband beats her, and she goes to the psychiatrist and she says, it must be something I did that made him beat me. She wants to believe that. Even little children who are beaten by their parents want to believe that they set it off, because the alternative is too frightening and too out of your control. If you didn't do anything as the wife or as the child, and you have just a hostile, violent person in your house that beats you for no reason and at any moment, your life is a hell, unless you can fight back. But if you can convince yourself that you are at fault, why then things are sunnier, because then there are things you can do by giving concessions, by being nicer, by appeasing. I think that goes along. I think we need to think more about that and have, we need to talk to our left-wing idiotic friends, or, or disillusioned, misled, misguided friends, to have them understand this dynamic. This is the dynamic that's moving them, I think.
Charles, I think you're absolutely right, and I don't think, however, that it's only a problem on the left. It seems to me to be pandemic and universal since 9/11 that many Americans on all sides of the spectrum, they have the idea that this is all our fault and that there's something that we can do to fix it. And I would say even on the largest scale possible, you have the United States pouring billions of dollars into places like Pakistan and Egypt, and in Afghanistan, building roads and schools and hospitals. Now, what's the underlying assumption of that? It seems to me that the underlying assumption of that is that if we show these people that we're actually on their side, and that we actually like them, and that we're doing good things for them, then they will stop hating us and all will be well. And the underlying assumption of that, in turn, is that this is something within our control. And it really is because we have done something to make them hate us that we can reverse by being likable. And that's why all this is happening. And the core assumption is that this is within our power to change. Yeah. And that it's not that they hate us for reasons of their own, that arise from their own belief system, but it's that they hate us because of our behavior. And our behavior is within our power to change. And so, George W. Bush had the American soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan going around and handing out soccer balls and candy to the kids and so on. And, it's interesting to note that just last week, at the time of this taping, an American soldier was killed in Afghanistan while he was playing with children. Yes. And a young Afghan came up and stabbed him in the neck and killed him. And he was playing with children because he had been taught by his superiors in Afghanistan that if he went out and showed a kind face of America to the Afghans, then he would be doing a valuable service to end this conflict. When in fact, the Afghan who killed him didn't care that he was playing with children, didn't care that he was a nice guy, only cared that he was a kuffar, an infidel, and an American, and that he would be rewarded by Allah for killing him, because the Quran says to slay the unbelievers wherever you find them. When you meet the unbelievers in battle, strike at their necks, and so on. And so he did. And this is not something that's going to be changed by any amount of hearts and minds initiative. And so I think that you're absolutely right that the left ultimately gives way to this idea and thinks that this is all our fault and that we have the power to fix it. But that's also, unfortunately, a very prevalent assumption among the ever-diminishing loyal opposition.
Yes, I would go another step, and I would say that we need to look at the underlying assumptions and presuppositions of this mindset. And one of them, which is probably the most touchy and sensitive, is we are all the same. Humans are all the same. And once you disagree with that, you're automatically written out of the conversation. So if we're all the same, I know that if I'm having a fight with somebody and he apologizes to me and gives me a gift and smiles at me and says, I'm sorry, let's be friends, I know I would do that. That's what I would do. And if everybody's the same, then therefore they will do that. And all I have to do is be nice because, as my mother told me when I had a fist fight on the playground, if you're nice to Johnny, Johnny will be nice to you. Well, maybe that worked out sometimes. But the fact is that cultures make people really, really different. And try to talk about that in a college classroom. Try to talk about how can it be that a mother in Judea, Samaria, the West Bank, would be happy that her son killed himself up as long as he blew up a whole bunch of Jews on the way? I mean, wouldn't your mother be like that? No, she wouldn't. My mother would not. So, we're touching the core of the deepest held beliefs of the politically correct moral relativism stuff when you talk about this. And that's what I think a lot of us, I think we need to do more work on that, more deconstructing of that business, because people are not going to hear the facts that we bring if they've already greased up their canvas, with this politically correct underpinning. The other thing that I think is a hidden presupposition in this is that we are all guilty in the West. After all, your children and mine, Robert, will have been brought up to live in a life that is better than, although, if Obama keeps running this place the way this may not be true in the future, but up until now, my daughters have a great life. And you know what? They didn't do a damn thing to get it. And they're decent kids. And because they're decent kids, they kind of feel bad about that, And so when they see darker skinned people, especially on television, who are poor, they feel bad. And, Amnesty International makes them feel even worse. And the left makes them feel that, what they have because we took it away from those people there. So there's a lot that is embedded, steeped and stewed. Our kids are steeped and stewed in this kind of anti-Western, anti-rational, anti-capitalist mindset that once that's there before, Robert, you and I talk to them about Islam or Israel or the Palestinians or anything. That's there preventing many of the facts that we have. They're factophobic. They're protected against these facts by these underlying presuppositions. And I think we need to do more work on that.
Definitely. What do you also say, Charles, that it's kind of an underlying ethnocentrism, that this is the group that claims to be multicultural, that claims to respect all cultures equally, that claims that people who say that Judeo-Christian civilization is something that is great and unprecedented in the history of the world are bigots and racists and so on. And yet they're manifesting a tremendous bigotry in assuming that the problem with the West and the Islamic world is all the West's fault, because it assumes that the Muslims are passive reactors who have no thoughts of their own and no ability to do anything on their own, but all they can do is react to what the big bad West does.
Well,
and
that's
that
the
seems
same.
to me to
They
be
learned
crowning
this from. Yeah, they learned this from the civil rights movement too, because that's how they think about blacks.
Well, that's ethnocentric as well.
Yes, black pastors and preachers know that that blacks and personal responsibility are an item, you know, and that blaming white people for everything that ever happened can't be very good for black people who therefore never take responsibility for their own actions, et cetera, et cetera. So this is something that we taught these kids before the Islamic problem came up. Just one more thing I think is important here, because the topic here should be, how do we get the Christian people in America to pick up the cause of the Christian suffering and persecution in the Middle East? That we must conquer that. That's a job that's on our heads. And I think that what worked for the slaves in Sudan was that we had people who were victims traveling around American campuses and churches and synagogues. You know Simon Dang.
Oh, yeah.
And there was Francis Bach. There were several others. And they were able to burst through the fog of political correctness and get to the hearts of the people in the audience. And I think that you and I and others in the field really need to work on getting those Christians from Iraq and from Egypt and from, I know there's some, but we have to put together a big program and to bring their voices directly, because the newspapers will block them out. The mainstream media will block them out. We have to get them person to person to meet Christians here in America, I believe.
Absolutely, absolutely. And of course, at the same time, yet another obstacle is the fact that the persecuted Christians themselves often don't want to speak out. I remember a few years back when Pamela Geller and I were putting together the big rallies at Ground Zero that were about the Ground Zero Mosque, but also about Islamic supremacism and jihad in general, that we had contacted a Coptic priest and asked him to come and offer a prayer at the beginning of the rally, because it was, after all, on September 11th, and we were remembering those who were killed there on that day. And he initially agreed, but then, thinking about it, he got back to us and refused, because he said that if it came out that he had done this, that it could cause harm to the Christians in Egypt. And I can't tell you how many Middle Eastern Christians have told me essentially the same thing, Charles, that they've undergone terrible persecutions. I have a friend actually from Lebanon who just got his house back after fighting with the government for 30 years, because 30 years ago, Muslims came and seized his house and threw him out. And he essentially had no recourse. But Lebanon is not entirely conquered at this point, and so he was, after 30 years of fighting, able to get his house back. I hear stories like this all the time, but the vast majority of the Christians who have undergone this kind of injustice, they don't want to say anything, because they think, well, it'll just be worse if we do for the people who are still there. And this is the problem, that it goes back to the status of dhimmitude, of the institutionalized subjugation of Christians and other non-Muslims under Islamic law. If they speak out about it, then this so-called contract of protection, because that's what the dhimma is, the zumma, it is an agreement of protection whereby Jews and Christians can live as Jews and Christians, but have to accept this status of chastened subservience. If they speak out about it, if they protest against the injustices being perpetrated against them, then this so-called contract of protection is revoked, and they can't even continue to live as Jews and Christians, but have to convert to Islam or die. And so I think that mindset is still so pervasive, and so many Christians from persecuted Muslim lands are afraid to speak out because they think speaking out will make matters worse.
You know, you can only cry when you hear that, because it's, it can be true, and I'm sure it can be true. But I think the way around that, you won't get the Coptic priests now until things, maybe you'll never get them. But I think that there are people, individuals, who will come and speak, and we know some, and I think we just need to develop to build more and more of a team of people who will speak. I think we can. We should try.
Oh, absolutely. I'm not saying we can't. I'm just noting that
Yeah,
yet another difficulty is that the people who are in the firing line of the oppression themselves
yeah,
often think that things will go better for them if they keep silent.
right. Well, what about the Christian communities here? They, you know, it really is a sin that the Christian communities here are silent.
Yes,
It's a sin. I can tell you from a people whose own people sinned here um, for not speaking up during World War II. I can tell you that this sin will stay with them for a long, long time. There are Jews who committed suicide because they realized that they should have opened up their mouths in the 40s. And there will be Christians here who know better, that they should speak out, and they're silent. I mean, shame on them. This is a terrible thing.
absolutely. Yes. And the short-sightedness of it is something that I think is going to dawn on them eventually.
Yeah.
That they will realize, well, nobody's calling me a racist or a bigot, but the causes of this persecution of Christians have now come to the West, and the persecution has escalated and is, in Europe, it's already become extraordinarily difficult for Jews in many areas, like in Paris and in Malmo, in Sweden, and some areas of Belgium. The Jews don't venture outside wearing a kippah or wearing a Star of David or something of that kind because they know they'll be physically attacked if they do. And if Christians think that this is never going to happen to them, they should remember the boy that you alluded to who was murdered in Egypt for having a cross tattooed on his hand. The same thing is going to happen in Europe and the United States. If non-Muslims don't start to unite and start to speak out forthrightly against this and to take the attacks of the politically correct authoritarians who will brand them as racists and bigots and Islamophobes, this is going to happen. But if people value the being friends with leftists more than they value the lives of the Christians and other non-Muslims who are being persecuted in the West, they're going to find eventually that this was a hideous choice that they made, and one that is ultimately suicidal.
And I think we'll move them the more we gather forces like you're doing, and more people hear your voice and hear those of us who are speaking about this. And I think we are gathering troops. And the more people that we gather, the more adherents, that people who see the truth, there'll be pressure on the failed leaders. There'll be a lot of pressure on the failed leaders to speak up.
Absolutely. And, well, we can only hope that this would happen before it's too late, and that we can bring political pressure on the leaders who have failed, pressure in the churches, pressure in the political arena. There is, unfortunately, in the Catholic Church, such a great deference and respect for bishops, and certainly, I'm all for being deferential and respectful to bishops, but these people are not perfect or infallible, and the idea that a bishop cannot be respectfully criticized when he makes a mistake, and when he is essentially by his silence consigning people to their fate who share his faith and whom he and in whose care they have been entrusted. It's completely wrongheaded, and it is absolutely imperative for Christian believers to dare to speak out against their leaders when their leaders are failing to speak out for their brethren who are being persecuted.
Yeah.
Also in the political arena, it's the same thing. Charles, it's never been a political issue, and that's because there's never been a sufficient block of people who will speak out and say something to their congressman and say, we're not going to vote for you unless you say something about this and do something about this. Obviously, there has to be a critical mass of people who are willing to do that if there's going to be any movement. But, well, that's our job, and that's why we're doing this show.
Right, right. And by the way, timely, you know that the Obama administration just said that, again, the victims of the Fort Hood massacre, which was an Islamic Jihad attack, that murdered people. They're not going to get the Purple Heart. And
Yeah.
there are more and more people becoming aware of what's really going on. And our job is to hurry it up. Hurry, hurry, more.
Yeah, and of course we have the obstacle of fighting against the initial stigmatization and demonization that the left and the mainstream media have already carried out upon us, such that we are racist, Islamophobic, anti-Muslim bigots in their eyes. And this causes, and this is the idea of these smears, this causes many people of goodwill to turn away without even examining what we're saying.
Yeah. But we understand that this is the long war, the long fight, and we're in it for the long run. And we're gaining adherents, Robert, as you know.
Absolutely.
And
Well,
we're
you know,
gaining.
the best ally on our side is the truth.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Charles Jacobs, we're just about out of time, and this has been an extraordinarily illuminating hour, and I thank you for it. Do you have any concluding words before our time is up?
Well, I suppose, as again, I'm a Jewish person, and my people have been through this, unfortunately, and in every aspect. I mean, we've been mass murdered and genocided and gassed, and many of us have been silent while the others were being killed. And I just want to warn the Christian world, don't make the same mistake. You will be really sorry and in sin if you do. So take courage, learn from these things, go to Jihad Watch, learn from all of us, and get active.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, the words are very well known, but they're more and more apt all the time, yet again. And those, of course, are the words of the poem by Pastor Niemöller, Martin Niemöller, who was a Lutheran pastor in Nazi Germany, initially a Nazi himself. But he grew more appalled precisely because of his Christian faith as one and another group were taken away. And he did not speak out until finally he himself was arrested. And he realized that had he spoken out for the people who they initially came for, then there might have been a group that would have been able to push back against this. But by the time they came for him, there was nobody left to speak out. This is the fate that Western Christians are looking at if they continue on the road that they're on. Charles Jacobs, it's been a great privilege to have you with us. This is the ABN Jihad Watch program, and I'm Robert Spencer. We'll be back next week with another interview with another hero of freedom. Thank you very much for joining us, and God bless you.